It's important to have a really great culture to have a sustainable business model over time, because people make our businesses go. Even though we're talking about technology companies, technology is developed by people. And so being able to attract and retain and progress and fulfill the people that come work for us is really critical. And importantly, focusing on those employees as well as customers is what will lead to better shareholder results. And so it's not just because it's a good thing to do, it's not just because it's a nice thing to do, and especially, of course, I want to include the environment, it's because it is a must-do in order to have sustainable results over time. Every technology company, whether it's 5 years old or 155 years old, has to adapt and change really fast. As we all know, the acceleration just over 2020 in adoption curves for different kinds of consumer technology experiences has increased tremendously. And of course, how we're all thinking about doing business is completely different as new capabilities become available. And so this idea of adaptability is really critical, and adaptability is really dependent, I believe, on direct, honest, authentic communication. It's really highly dependent upon the ability for folks to come together across functions and really understand from the user's perspective all the way through to the service perspective, how to develop products and services and deliver and execute on products and services.
And for us, a critical factor in determining who the winners of the futures are is not only a growth mindset of the management team, but a very strong ESG stance. So we see that those as very strong alpha factors for our performance over time, very similar to what Susan mentioned. The reason is that having a vision, having authentic leadership around values is something that's going to become much more important for employee retention, employee hiring, and also for customer trust. So at the end of the day, I see ESG a little bit as sort of the next generation of sales and marketing and recruiting. It's really about what you stand for. Culture is a tricky thing to evaluate as an investor, for sure. But we look at metrics. We try to, for each category of ESG, we try to be as tangible as possible. We have a lot of discussions with our portfolio companies around certain metrics. And certain just attitudes, how are they looking, for instance, this year at reopening, what's their strategy about flexibility of work between office and home. So a lot of it is, dynamic in discussions. But in terms of culture, I think one metric that we like to look at is voluntary churn. So, if there's a good culture, you'll be able to retain people for longer. You don't have to rehire, as many new people, because people are really excited about what you stand for and the vision. So that's maybe one metric that I would, reference there. And then, on the culture side, it's not only internal culture, it's external culture. We're also pretty focused on the consumer side on, what's your net promoter score? How easily are you going to recommend, the company's services to somebody else? So, maybe those are two concrete things that we try to proxy, but I wouldn't say that that's all we're doing. These qualitative assessments in our corporate dialogues are a big portion of, how we view the culture and the strength of the leadership.
We have demonstrable information that you can make decisions about, whether whether you are an investor or you are a director, I want to make sure that you have data that's clear and granular and actionable. So just a few things. I know that the focus of this panel is specifically on technology. So I want to talk a little bit about how we use technology to identify and act on gaps in this space. So probably many of your companies do self-ID surveys in the US, potentially out depending on privacy considerations. So in 2020, we expanded our global self-ID survey so we could get a better understanding of our workforce composition and to better identify and serve our employees, and also to get better information about intersectionality. So we're disaggregating racial categories or rolling out caregiver status so that we can identify when someone takes care of children, or if they take care of parents, a spouse, or another family member, which was particularly important during COVID. I don't know about your companies, but COVID, to me, it just sharply drew all the lines of inequity along all dimensions of ESG issues, including caregiver status, right? And whether or not you needed flexibility to manage your workday in a way that's most appropriate for you. So we collect all this data. So we get all this data, but what do you do with it then? There's a lot of risks with having big data. The next thing you have to do to collect it is make sense of it. And only after that can you prudently act on it. So we have a tool called Vizier, which helps show us how we're doing on attrition, retention, promotion, performance, and management. And that helps us see in real time how we're doing on representation in all those areas. We also use tools like Textio, which reviews job descriptions for gender bias or any other kind of bias, because maybe that job description only appeals to one type of audience and not another.
We have 3 action areas that we're focused on, and I'll walk you through them to give you a highlight of how we're putting technology to work to achieve these goals. First, we're lowering our carbon intensity as cost efficiently as possible. Second, we're increasing the use of renewables and offsets in support of our business. And third, we're investing in low carbon technologies to enable commercial solutions. And it's very important that as part of our lowering the carbon intensity, we have metrics for oil, gas, methane, and flaring. And we have designed those metrics on what we are calling the equity basis and a commodity basis. And I emphasize that because we are one of the first among our peers to use that equity basis to measure our greenhouse gas emissions contributions. That's important because equity means that we are measuring what Chevron's ownership interests are in emissions, not just the assets that we operate, but those assets that we don't operate as well. A number of companies have made pledges about reducing their emissions, but they're only covering their operated emissions. And that means if you have a lot of joint ventures in Russia that you're not operating, you're not telling us how you're going to reduce those emissions. And so it's very important to be as honest as possible in terms of how are we contributing to a solution that the whole world is pointed at in terms of reducing carbon. The other thing that makes our approach different is that it's commodity-based. And there, what we mean is we have a metric focused on oil use and one on gas use. And that's important because oil is mainly a transportation fuel versus gas is used mainly for power. Again, we thought that was very important to separate because instead of trying to just shift things in your portfolio from maybe a more intense oil to a less intense emission gas, you're just playing an accounting game versus really trying to contribute again to the solutions the world needs to reduce emissions in the transportation sector, reduce emissions on the power sector.